Long before the world knew the name Michael Rockefeller, it already knew his father. In the early hours of almost every morning, while much of New York was still asleep, Nelson Rockefeller was already working. His desk overflowed with reports from lawmakers, economists, architects, and advisors. Telephones rang constantly. Secretaries moved briskly through hallways carrying folders that would influence the lives of millions of Americans. Outside his office, reporters waited patiently for a statement. Inside, governors sought his approval, business leaders requested meetings, and foreign dignitaries hoped to secure an audience. This was not merely another wealthy businessman. This was a man many believed would one day become president of the United States. Born into the extraordinary Rockefeller dynasty, Nelson understood that privilege came with relentless expectations. His grandfather, John D. Rockefeller, had built Standard Oil into the greatest industrial empire of its age, transforming the family's name into a symbol recognized across the globe. That fortune financed universities, hospitals, scientific research, museums, and charitable foundations whose influence still shapes the modern world. Yet Nelson wanted history to remember him for more than inherited wealth. He wanted to build something of his own. Public service became his calling. As governor of New York, he launched ambitious infrastructure projects, expanded higher education, strengthened environmental conservation, and championed the arts with an energy that earned both admiration and criticism. Friends described him as tireless. Opponents called him relentless. Both agreed on one thing. When Nelson Rockefeller confronted a problem, he refused to believe it could not be solved. That confidence followed him home. Behind the headlines, campaign speeches, and political negotiations was a devoted father who treasured moments away from public life. Family dinners, conversations with his children, and weekends beyond the reach of cameras reminded him that titles were temporary, but family endured. Of all his children, his youngest son fascinated him the most. Michael possessed the same determination that had driven generations of Rockefellers, but it pointed in an entirely different direction. While Nelson found purpose in government, Michael searched for it in forgotten civilizations. While the father spent his days surrounded by senators, diplomats, and industrial leaders, the son filled his shelves with books on anthropology, archaeology, and indigenous cultures. Their conversations were often less about politics than about ideas. Nelson admired Michael's intelligence, though he quietly wondered where such curiosity might eventually lead him. Like every parent, he hoped his children would build meaningful lives. Yet he also understood something experience had taught him over decades of leadership. The qualities that make extraordinary people successful are often the very qualities that place them in extraordinary danger. Determination can become obsession. Curiosity can overpower caution. The willingness to venture where others refuse to go has changed history, but has also claimed countless lives. The American public saw the Rockefellers as a family blessed beyond imagination. Newspapers celebrated their achievements, their philanthropy, and the enormous influence they exercised across politics, finance, science, and culture. To millions of people, the Rockefeller name represented stability, confidence, and success. Few noticed that behind those headlines another story had quietly begun unfolding. Over the years, the family would endure unexpected deaths, heartbreaking personal losses, public scandals, and tragedies that seemed strangely disproportionate for a dynasty that appeared to possess everything. Journalists would eventually write about an unusual pattern of misfortune that shadowed the family across generations. Whether those tragedies were nothing more than coincidence or simply the unavoidable burden of living under constant public scrutiny remains a matter of perspective. But in 1961, none of those stories had yet become legend. There was only a father preparing for another demanding day of public service, and a son preparing for a journey that would change both of their lives forever. Neither could possibly imagine that within weeks the most powerful resource Nelson Rockefeller had ever relied upon, his ability to solve problems, would meet the one mystery it could never overcome. The son who chose a different world. For Michael Rockefeller, privilege was never enough. Born into one of the wealthiest families in history, he could have lived comfortably within a world of boardrooms, political influence, private estates, and endless opportunity. The Rockefeller name alone opened doors that most people would never even see. Yet the future others imagined for him never seemed to satisfy the questions quietly forming in his mind. While many young men of his generation admired skyscrapers, industry, or Wall Street, Michael found himself captivated by something far older. He wanted to understand civilizations that had survived without modern cities, cultures whose traditions had been passed from one generation to the next long before Europe or America knew they existed. After graduating from Harvard in 1960, where he studied history and economics while developing an increasing fascination with anthropology, Michael began looking beyond classrooms and museums. Books could explain artifacts, but they could never fully explain the people who created them. He wanted to stand where they stood, hear their language, watch their ceremonies, and understand the beliefs that gave those remarkable objects meaning. Friends admired his intelligence, but those closest to him recognized another quality that had quietly grown stronger over the years. Once Michael became fascinated by an idea, he pursued it with remarkable determination. It was the same relentless curiosity that had driven generations of Rockefellers to build businesses, universities, and public institutions. In Michael, however, that determination was pulling him away from the comfortable world his family knew and toward one of the least explored regions on Earth. That opportunity arrived through Harvard's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, whose curators were increasingly concerned that many indigenous cultures were changing faster than historians could document them. Across the world, traditional ways of life were disappearing under the influence of modernization, colonial administration, missionaries, and expanding trade. Michael believed that preserving these cultures was not merely an academic exercise, but a race against time. Among all the places that captured his imagination, none fascinated him more than the vast swamps and rivers of Netherlands' New Guinea, today part of Indonesia, home to the Asmat people. Their ancestor poles rose like towering sculptures from the earth. Their ceremonial shields, drums, and carvings were unlike anything found elsewhere in the world. To outsiders, they appeared mysterious, even intimidating. Sensational newspaper stories often portrayed the Asmat as fierce warriors living beyond the reach of civilization. But anthropologists who had spent time among them described something entirely different. They spoke of extraordinary artists whose carvings preserved family histories, honored ancestors, and reflected a deeply spiritual understanding of life and death. Michael became convinced that the world had misunderstood them. Rather than collecting objects simply because they were rare, he wanted to preserve the stories they represented before they vanished forever. In 1961, Michael traveled to New Guinea accompanied by Dutch anthropologist René Wassing and local guides who understood the rivers better than any map ever could. Almost immediately, he immersed himself in village life. He sat with master carvers as they transformed massive tree trunks into ancestor poles whose intricate figures represented generations of memory. He observed ceremonies that outsiders had seldom witnessed and carefully recorded details that museums back home could never capture on their own. Unlike explorers driven by conquest or adventure, Michael approached the Asmat with genuine respect. He listened more than he spoke. He exchanged gifts. He patiently earned trust in communities where trust could never be demanded. Letters sent home reflected his excitement. He described remarkable works of art, fascinating conversations, and a growing appreciation for people whose understanding of family, honor, and ancestry differed profoundly from his own yet felt deeply meaningful. Nelson read those letters with pride, relieved that his son had found a purpose that genuinely fulfilled him. Yet even as he admired Michael's passion, a father's instincts never disappeared completely. New Guinea remained one of the most remote places on Earth. Vast mangrove forests stretched for miles without roads. Rivers changed with every tide. Storms formed with astonishing speed. Even experienced Dutch patrols traveled cautiously through regions where local knowledge meant the difference between arriving safely or disappearing altogether. Michael understood the risks, but he also believed careful preparation and patience could overcome them. It was a belief remarkably similar to the one his father had relied upon throughout his own life. Neither man realized that within days they would discover there are some places where preparation, intelligence, and determination are no match for the unpredictable power of nature. And on the morning of November 18, 1961, that lesson would begin with the launch of a small wooden boat into the waters of the Arafura Sea. The day a father lost control. By November 1961, Michael Rockefeller no longer felt like a visitor in New Guinea. Months of living among the Asmat had transformed his understanding of the region and the people who called it home. He had learned that their towering ancestor poles were not simply remarkable works of art but sacred monuments connecting the living with those who had gone before them. He understood that every carving preserved the memory of a family, every ceremonial object carried generations of belief, and every village possessed traditions that outsiders rarely understood. The sensational stories published in Western newspapers about savage tribes and dangerous jungles seemed painfully incomplete to him. Michael had seen kindness, laughter, craftsmanship, and extraordinary hospitality. Yet he had also learned another lesson. This was a land governed by forces far older than governments or maps. Rivers changed with the tides. Storms arrived without warning. Vast stretches of mangrove forest concealed villages, invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the landscape. Even experienced Dutch patrols depended upon indigenous guides to navigate safely. Nature, not man, remained in command. Ironically, it was this respect for the region that made Michael believe he understood it well enough to continue pushing deeper into territory few outsiders had ever explored. On the morning of November 18, 1961, Michael departed with Dutch anthropologist René Wassing and two local guides aboard a narrow wooden boat powered by a small outboard engine. Their objective was straightforward: travel along the southern coast to visit additional Asmat communities where Michael hoped to document ceremonial carvings before they disappeared into private collections or were lost forever. The journey began quietly beneath a tropical sky, but the Arafura Sea has earned its reputation through generations of unpredictable violence. As the overloaded boat pressed farther from shore, heavy swells began striking its sides with increasing force. Water poured into the vessel faster than it could be removed. The engine struggled desperately against the growing current before finally falling silent. Suddenly, the four men were no longer travelers. They were survivors. Without power, the small boat drifted helplessly across open water as wave after wave crashed against its wooden hull. Then came the moment every mariner fears. A powerful swell rolled beneath the vessel, lifting it violently before turning it completely upside down. Thrown into the sea, the men surfaced beside the overturned boat and clung to its slippery underside while miles of empty ocean stretched in every direction. There was no radio call, no emergency beacon, no certainty that anyone even knew where they had vanished. Hour after hour, they drifted beneath the relentless tropical sun. Salt water burned their eyes and cracked their lips. Hunger gave way to exhaustion. As daylight faded, darkness settled across the sea, broken only by distant stars and the constant sound of waves striking the overturned hull. Sharks were known to patrol these waters. Powerful currents continued carrying them farther from land. By morning, the two indigenous guides made the courageous decision to swim toward shore in search of help. Michael and René remained with the drifting boat, hoping rescue would arrive before the current carried them into deeper water. Nearly 24 hours after the accident, Michael stared toward the distant coastline shimmering on the horizon. It looked close enough to reach. Waiting, he believed, meant surrendering to the sea. Calmly, he tied two empty fuel cans beneath his shirt to help keep himself afloat. Then he turned toward René and quietly said the words that history would never forget. "I think I can make it." Without another word, the 23-year-old slipped into the water and began swimming toward land. René watched until Michael became nothing more than a small silhouette rising and falling between the waves. Then gradually he disappeared. It was the last confirmed sighting of Michael Rockefeller. More than 9,000 miles away, Nelson Rockefeller was carrying out the responsibilities of governing New York when the message reached him. Those who knew him understood his instinct in moments of crisis. He did not panic. He acted. Within hours, telephones connected New York to Washington, The Hague, and Dutch New Guinea. Government officials were contacted. Aircraft were assembled. Naval vessels changed course. Search teams were organized with remarkable speed. Nelson himself boarded an aircraft for New Guinea, unwilling to remain behind while others searched for his son. The governor who had spent decades solving political crises now found himself confronting a problem unlike any he had ever faced. Day after day, he stood beside Dutch officials studying maps covered with search grids. He listened as pilots reported another unsuccessful flight. He watched patrol boats disappear down winding rivers before returning empty once again. Every evening ended the same way, with silence. Witnesses later remembered seeing not the commanding politician America had come to admire, but exhausted fathers staring across endless mangrove swamps, waiting for someone, anyone, to arrive with the words he longed to hear. "We found him." Those words never came. The largest private search operation of its time gradually came to an end, but for Nelson Rockefeller, the search itself would continue for the rest of his life. And as hope slowly gave way to uncertainty, the world began asking a question that remains unanswered more than 6 decades later. If Michael Rockefeller did not drown, then who or what was waiting for him when he reached the shore? The mystery that changed the Rockefellers forever. When the official search was finally suspended, the world moved on. Newspapers found new headlines. Politicians returned to their campaigns. Ships resumed their normal routes through the Arafura Sea. But for Nelson Rockefeller, life never truly returned to normal. Every morning, he still walked into government offices where impossible decisions awaited him. He continued leading New York through moments of political tension, economic uncertainty, and enormous public projects. The cameras still followed him. The speeches still had to be delivered. The responsibilities of public office demanded that he continue moving forward. Yet those closest to him noticed a quiet change. Somewhere beneath the confident public image was a father carrying a question no advisor could answer. Every unexpected telephone call interrupted his thoughts. Every new report arriving from New Guinea demanded his attention. Every rumor, no matter how improbable, was carefully examined. Unlike most families who lose someone they love, the Rockefellers were never given certainty. There was no funeral to attend, no grave where flowers could be placed, no final goodbye. There was only silence. And sometimes silence can be more painful than grief itself, because grief eventually teaches acceptance, while uncertainty keeps hope alive long after reason tells us to let go. As months turned into years, investigators continued searching for answers. The simplest explanation was that Michael had drowned before reaching land. Experienced swimmers have disappeared in far calmer waters, and the currents of the Arafura Sea are among the most unpredictable in the region. Many investigators believed exhaustion alone would have made survival nearly impossible. Yet even this theory left one haunting question unanswered. If Michael had drowned, why was nothing ever recovered? Search aircraft covered hundreds of miles of coastline. Patrol boats searched rivers and estuaries. Indigenous trackers explored remote shorelines. Yet no camera, no clothing, no life preserver, and no human remains were ever found. That complete absence of evidence allowed another theory to emerge, one that would haunt the Rockefeller family for generations. Several Dutch officials, missionaries, and later anthropologists reported hearing stories that a young white man had reached the shore alive. According to those accounts, he may have entered an Asmat village where memories of recent clashes with Dutch colonial forces were still painfully fresh. Some researchers suggested that Michael may have been mistaken for one of those outsiders and became the victim of an act of revenge rooted in traditions few Westerners understood. Decades later, author Carl Hoffman traveled repeatedly into the Asmat region, interviewing elders whose stories echoed those earlier reports. Some claimed they knew exactly what happened. Others denied everything. Even after years of investigation, no physical evidence emerged that could transform rumor into established history. Like the jungle itself, the truth remained hidden behind layers of uncertainty. Then came perhaps the most extraordinary theory of all. Could Michael Rockefeller have survived? Over the decades, scattered reports described a light-skinned man living among remote Asmat communities. Grainy photographs circulated through newspapers and documentaries. Travelers claimed to have heard stories from villagers about a foreigner who had chosen never to return home. The idea captured imaginations around the world because it offered something every family longs for when faced with uncertainty: hope. But every investigation reached the same conclusion. The photographs could not be authenticated. The witnesses contradicted one another. No credible evidence ever proved that Michael lived beyond November 1961. The mystery remained exactly where it had begun, balanced uneasily between possibility and probability. Historians generally agree that drowning remains the most likely explanation, while acknowledging that the lack of definitive evidence leaves room for enduring debate. It is this rare combination of likelihood without proof that has kept the case alive for more than 60 years. Looking back today, it is remarkable how history remembers Nelson Rockefeller. His achievements were extraordinary. He governed America's largest state. He helped shape modern public education, transportation, environmental conservation, and the arts. He later became the 41st Vice President of the United States, cementing his place among the most influential political figures of the 20th century. Yet for millions of people, one question has come to define his legacy more than any election, speech, or public office. What happened to Michael Rockefeller? Some writers have described the many tragedies experienced by different generations of the Rockefeller family as evidence of a mysterious pattern while others argue that a family living so prominently in the public eye naturally sees every loss magnified before the world. Whatever explanation one chooses, Michael's disappearance became the most enduring chapter in that narrative. It reminds us that enormous wealth can build cities, influence governments, fund scientific breakthroughs, and preserve history itself, but it cannot bargain with fate. Somewhere beyond the mangrove forests of New Guinea lies a truth that has resisted every search, every investigation, and every passing decade. Nelson Rockefeller spent his life believing that determination, preparation, and action could overcome almost any obstacle. Yet the greatest challenge he ever faced offered no solution, no victory, and no final answer. Perhaps that is why this story continues to endure, not because it belongs to one of the richest families in history, but because beneath the wealth, titles, and public legacy, it is ultimately the story of a father who never stopped waiting for his son to come home. The question that outlived a dynasty. History remembers the Rockefeller family for building one of the greatest fortunes the modern world has ever known. Their wealth helped finance universities that educated generations of leaders, hospitals that saved countless lives, museums that preserve humanity's greatest artistic achievements, and scientific discoveries that changed the course of medicine. Few families have exercised such lasting influence over business, philanthropy, conservation, and public service. Nelson Rockefeller devoted his own life to expanding that legacy. He governed New York during one of its most transformative periods and later became the 41st Vice President of the United States, earning a place among America's most influential statesmen. Yet despite all those accomplishments, history would leave him with one question no title, election, or achievement could ever answer. It was not a question about politics. It was not about wealth or power. It was the same question every father would ask. What happened to my son? That question followed Nelson Rockefeller for the remainder of his life. Every anniversary reopened the wound. Every new expedition to New Guinea revived hope. Every documentary, every book, every rumor offered the possibility that somewhere, somehow, the truth might finally emerge. It never did. Perhaps that is why the story continues to resonate more than 6 decades later. It is tempting to view it as an adventure, an exploration, or one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Yet beneath all of those labels lies something profoundly human. It is the story of two remarkable men who loved one another but were called toward different destinies. Nelson believed that leadership could improve the lives of millions through government, education, and public service. Michael believed humanity could better understand itself by preserving cultures that the modern world barely recognized. One sought to shape the future. The other sought to preserve the past. Neither could have imagined that their separate journeys would ultimately become inseparable. A father's greatest accomplishment would never erase the pain of losing his son. A son's extraordinary curiosity would forever become part of one of history's enduring mysteries. Even today, the rivers and mangrove forests of southern New Guinea guard their silence. The tides continue to rise and fall as they did in November 1961. Villages that once welcomed Michael Rockefeller have changed with time, while others have disappeared altogether. The witnesses who might have known the truth have largely passed into history themselves. What remains are fragments, field notes, government reports, faded photographs, oral traditions, and memories carried across generations. Historians continue debating the evidence. Anthropologists revisit old testimony. Explorers still retrace Michael's final route, hoping that one overlooked detail might finally reveal what happened after he disappeared beyond the waves. But perhaps some mysteries survive because they remind us that history does not always provide the answers we seek. If there is one lesson hidden within the story of Nelson and Michael Rockefeller, it is this: wealth can build empires, influence governments, and transform the world, but cannot protect us from the uncertainties that define the human experience. Love cannot guarantee safety. Power cannot bargain with fate. Influence cannot command the truth to reveal itself. Somewhere beyond the rivers of New Guinea lies an answer that has remained hidden for more than 60 years. Until that answer is found, Michael Rockefeller's disappearance will remain more than an unsolved case. It will remain a timeless reminder that beneath every famous name, every great fortune, and every public legacy are families who hope, who grieve, and who search, just like everyone else. Thank you for joining us on Tilt and Chill. If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's most fascinating mysteries, subscribe and join us as we continue exploring the forgotten places, remarkable lives, and unanswered questions that continue to shape our understanding of the world. Until next time, remember, Sometimes history's greatest mysteries are not the ones hidden in ancient ruins, but the ones carried quietly in a parent heart.